undisputed, most diabolical fantasy villains in the world, Fantasy Brains!
What's up, Brainiacs? Welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Brains podcast. This is going to be episode 7 of the 32-team series, a series where we are going through all 32 NFL teams and analyzing them from a fantasy football perspective. So if you haven't checked out episodes 1 through 6, definitely head over to our YouTube channel and check them out. We already covered the entirety of the AFC North, and at this point, this is episode 3 of the NFC North. We started out with the Green Bay Packers and then the Chicago Bears, and then today we are going to go with the Detroit Lions, a very exciting team. Obviously, the Lions were the number 1 seed in the NFL last year, had the best offense in the league, but they also lost a lot of pieces in free agency and the offseason. So very excited to talk about this team today. But like I said, we're going to be discussing the full Lions offense today, which means if you look to my right, we got the fantasy whiteboard. We're going to be going over stuff like the depth chart changes from last year to this year, the fantasy football forecast, which includes statting out every single player on their offense and where we think they're going to finish on the season compared to where they're currently being drafted right now. We're going to be looking at their strength of schedule per position group, as well as their fantasy playoff schedule for those weeks 15, 16, and 17. And then we'll cap off the episode with some storylines that could change the course of the season for this team. Now, before we get started, make sure to follow us on all of our social media accounts at Leatherbrains. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on TikTok, where we're posting a ton of daily fantasy content. You can also head over to YouTube and hit the subscribe button to find all of the rest of our episodes, stuff like fantasy film breakdowns on the rookies in this past draft class, some overvalued and undervalued players in Dynasty, as well as all the episodes from the Leatherbrains podcast every Tuesday at 6 p.m. With the other group of guys. But like I said, let's get right into this one. So looking at the Detroit Lions, I mean, this is a team that last year they had, I would say, a lot of expectation going into it. The year before, they blow the lead in the NFC Championship to the 49ers. And so they're coming back kind of with a vengeance, coming back with a couple more pieces, supposed to be more of a fluid team. And they looked great throughout the regular season. And what really looked great for them was their offense. And so Jared Goff is still going to be their quarterback this year. He inked an extension, I believe it was last offseason, well-deserved. He threw for 4,600 yards and 37 touchdowns last year. Now, I will say once we get to my projections, it's pretty hard to project any quarterback for throwing for 4,600 yards, let alone a player like Jared Goff. But I think with Goff, he's a great passer of the football. He's going to sling the rock. And the Lions were up in a lot of games last year, which kind of took him out of the game script. And it meant that they had to run the ball a little bit more once they got to the fourth quarter. And now with maybe more of an even playing field this year for the Lions, that's where we could start to see even more pass volume. So I think Goff could be in for a huge year, but he will retain the starting quarterback spot on this team. At the running back position, we have Jamyr Gibbs coming off a tremendous season as the fantasy running back 1. He truly broke out. I don't think this is surprising to anyone. Jamyr Gibbs was my favorite player in that draft class. I mean, Bijan is a terrific talent, and they are both, 1A, 1B running backs, but Jamyr Gibbs is just electric when the ball gets in his hands. And he really showed those last 3 games of the season when David Montgomery was out, how high his ceiling is as a player, where he was averaging over 30 points in fantasy per game for those last 3 weeks, which were in the fantasy playoffs. So definitely won a lot of people money. But he had 52 catches and a whopping 20 touchdowns on the season last year. And then you have David Montgomery, who is still a very solid change of pace runner. I still believe he's going to be on the field for at least 30 to 40% of the snaps. He had 1,100 yards last year and 14 touchdowns, also with 36 catches, which might be surprising to some people. And he missed 3 games as well. So if you're looking at Montgomery, he had a great year last year, even with Gibbs breaking out for the RB1, which just kind of showed how elite this offense truly was. Looking at the receiver core, again, very similar to the rest of this team. It's going to be the same from last year. We got Amon-Ra St. leading the pack. He's going to be the slot receiver on this team. He had 115 catches for a little bit over 1,200 yards last year and 12 touchdowns. I mean, you can't get a safer player than St. Brown. He's been a top 10 to 15 receiver for the past 3 years or so. And you just know with him every single week you have a very safe floor because they're always going to be able to get the ball into his hands. And I guess that is going to be somewhat of a question mark now when you have, their offensive coordinator in Ben Johnson leaving. And so the offense might look different. But considering that Amon-Ra St. Brown is a star player, I do not see any reason why he will not continue to be. I think this is where we start to get to the interesting part of the lineup, which is, Jameson Williams, who had a breakout last year, 58 catches, 1,000 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And I think, that looks like a breakout year for JMO. He finishes in, the 20s for receiver, but he only had 58 catches, which in a full PPR league is not as great because 58 catches, that's really a low end wide receiver 2, maybe a receiver 3 on most teams in the NFL. Now that it's a very pass heavy league, they added an extra game to the season. So I think with Jameson Williams, you're really hoping for that breakout this year. And I know he broke out last year, but a breakout into that star level. He went into the good receiver category this year. Can he get to that next level of being great or a star receiver? And I think the biggest thing for him is being able to get more opportunities. And I think with the new offensive coordinator coming in, with a potentially new offense, that's where you could see Amon-Ra, who had 115 catches, and then Jameson Williams only with 58, basically about half of that. I think that's where we actually could see some difference. Maybe that evens out a little bit more if Williams is able to take that step this year. You have Tim Patrick, who's going to be the blocking receiver in this offense. And then you have Isaac Tisla, round 3 pick out of Arkansas. Now, I will say the Lions did trade a decent amount to get him. So I do think that he is valuable in dynasty leagues as a late round stash. But 23 years old, he had a pretty long college career. I don't think he does anything crazy this year, but this does kind of beg the question of Jameson Williams coming up in a contract year. Does this mean that they might not re-sign him because they have a lot of other people they need to re-sign? And then maybe, Isaac Tisla replaces him long term. But obviously, that's not a need for this year. I don't think Isaac Tisla is going to do anything major this year. But for everyone out there in your dynasty leagues, he is a solid sleeper and somebody that, the Lions did try to go out and get. And they've drafted some pretty good players as of recent. And one of those players that, was a star their first year and was good their second year, but not as good was Sam LaPorta. And Sam LaPorta in his, rookie year, tight end 1 on the season, caught over 10 touchdowns. He was incredible. And last year, he was injured for the first half of the season, so he was very limited in his role. I already kind of mentioned it earlier with I wouldn't say negative game script because Goff still threw for 4,600 yards, but they were playing from ahead a lot of the time, which meant that, Goff wasn't just sitting back and just airing it out. It was more of deep passes to Jameson Williams, screen pass to Amon-Ra, dumping it off to the running back. And so LaPorta goes out last year for 60 catches, about 700 yards and 7 touchdowns. And so I think what people have to realize about Sam LaPorta is that he's an elite talent and he's only 23 years old. Most tight ends don't break out until their 3rd or 4th year, if you look at historical data. So I think with LaPorta, what we've seen out of him is 1 tight end 1 season and then another top 10 season, which was considered disappointing. And obviously people were drafting him as a tight end 1 last year, so you're going to be disappointed off that. But I think LaPorta is a very big candidate for a bounce back year, and I'm excited to definitely talk about him once we get to that. And then when we look at their O-line, this is really one of the only teams where it takes a massive hit. You have Frank Ragnow, their all-pro center, retiring, and then Kevin Zeitler leaving in free agency, as well as both coordinators. And you have Ben Johnson, who's the assistant coach of the year, goes to the Chicago Bears, and you have Aaron Glenn, who goes to the New York Jets. So you're going to see a very different offense this year, and you're going to see worse O-line play, which I think the biggest person that is affected by this is going to be David Montgomery, just because I don't think the run lanes are going to be as clear this year. I'm not saying the Lions aren't going to figure it out at the O-line, but I think they go from a top 3 elite O-line to more of a above average around the 8 to 15 range in terms of O-lines in the league. But let's get on to the fantasy football forecast at this point. I got the Lions passing for about 4,000 yards in the season and 28 touchdowns with 380 completions. So I think they're going to throw the ball a ton, just like they did last year. But I think, of anything, Goff might be a little bit less efficient and throw the ball more times, hence why he's going to have a little bit more completions than last year. But I still think, this is one of my highest projected offenses at this point. I think Goff he's a great gunslinger, like I mentioned. I think he knows how to get his players the ball. So when you look at Jared Goff, I have him go, like I said, about 4,000 yards, 28 touchdowns, and that's going to place him actually around the quarterback 19 on the season. And right now, he's getting drafted as a quarterback 10 or 11. It's switching up very consistently. And I've talked about it, in the last video with Caleb. My quarterbacks, like 8 through 20, are all so close together that there's good reason to wait on any of those guys, to expect guys that are being drafted in the receiver 15 through 20 range to be able to be used as a potential quarterback one this season. And so I think people are drafting Goff very high. He was my most drafted quarterback last season, and he's had 3 straight years of being great. But I think there's a lot of quarterback talent out there in fantasy football this year. And I think with losing both coordinators, losing 2 offensive linemen, I think the offense could have a little bit of a hiccup this year, especially in the first half of the season where it might take them some time to figure it out. But you also talk about a guy like Goff who doesn't have much rushing upside. And so that's where some of these other quarterbacks are really going to propel over him, is that, Goff can go out there and throw for a ton of yards and throw for a ton of touchdowns, but he's not going to get those rushing points like quarterbacks Jaden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, Bo Nix, Drake May, etc., that they're going to get, no matter if those guys are going at the top or in those mid-round quarterback ranges. But at the receiver position, in terms of where, these 4,000 yards are going, I have Amon-Ra going for about 1,050 yards, 100 catches, and 8 touchdowns. So I have him having another fantastic year. However, I do have him slowing down a little bit. I have him about 200 less yards, about 15 less catches, and about 4 less touchdowns. I think the touchdowns is the biggest thing that we could see regression. I mean, 12 touchdowns for kind of a smaller slot receiver. I'm not saying that it's impossible for him to score double-digit touchdowns again, but I think that those touchdowns could be more dispersed this year, like I said, to guys like Sam LaPorta. And I think as a team, they're just going to be scoring a little bit less than they did last year, just as it's so hard to repeat what you do the year before, especially with how great they are. So I think Amon-Ra is still going to have a tremendous year overall. I have him finishing as my receiver 11. He's being drafted as the receiver 4, and I have no problem taking him inside the top 10 receivers. Again, all of these rankings are based on how we statted out these players. And so, with St. Brown, I think I'm just more projecting that players like Jameson Williams and Sam LaPorta are going to take on a little bit of a bigger role this year in the offense, and that production might come out of St. Brown. So I think St. Brown, receiver 1 for sure. Very, very safe pick. He has been great the last 3 seasons. So I think he is definitely a good guy to get at the end of the first, early second round of your drafts. And then looking at Jameson Williams, the receiver 2, I have Jameson Williams going for about 70 catches for about 850 yards and 6 touchdowns, as well as another rushing touchdown. So 7 touchdowns total. Now you might say, I think, why do you have Jameson Williams only going for 850 yards? You just said that you had him, doing better than last year, and he had 1,000. Again, when you're statting all this out, so many things can change, and you really can't predict a player to go that much above his projection. If you look, because I believe the lines were posted, if you start to look at these players over-unders on the season, Jameson Williams is going to be around that range of the 850, 875. And again, I'm high on him compared to where I have him statted out here. So I do think in terms of upside, in terms of weekly upside especially, Jameson Williams has great upside in this offense, because if he can cement himself as more of a 1B to Amon-Ra St. Brown as opposed to the receiver 2 and receiver 1, that's when we could see a huge value bump in Jameson Williams. And he's still a really young player coming into year 4, and we've only really seen him play 2 real seasons in the NFL. So very excited with his speed and his athleticism, what he'll be able to do in this offense this year. And I think of all these players in the Lions, he has the highest chance of really outperforming where he is currently being drafted. So I have him right now as my receiver 32. He's going as the receiver 27. So statistically, I'm actually a little bit low on him, but mentally, I do like him a lot. And I think in that range of receiver 24 to 35, I think all those guys are very comparable, which is why they're all so similar in my rankings. Looking at Sam LaPorta, who's going to be the last relevant pass catcher in this offense, I think LaPorta goes for a huge bounce back year. I got him going for about 75 receptions, 850 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So I think he's going to have a really good year. I think LaPorta is a very talented player, and I think that the Lions know they have to rely on him. And it was tough for him last year because you have Amon-Ra and you have Gibbs, who are both safety blankets over the middle of the field for Goff. So that just kind of takes away from LaPorta. But I think if the Lions are smart and they want to preserve some of those other players, I think that's when you get LaPorta involved. That's when you unleash him. And he's going to prove that he is not only great at, running routes and catching the ball, but he's great once the ball is in his hands. And I think he'll show that he can make plays after the catch, which is something that he was a little bit limited by last year due to his early season injuries. So I got LaPorta finishing as my tight end 6. He's being drafted as the tight end 4. So again, similar situation. I think he's a top 5, top 6 tight end. I think that he is very good, but he's not reaching that top 3 of, Kittle, Trey McBride, Brock Bowers. I'd even slide Evan Ingram in there too. I'm very high on him. But I think that elite tier and that elite potential, I would not put him in there. But I think we have obviously seen a tight end 1 season out of him. So with him, I think it's a very safe pick. And you also have the upside as well if they decide to be a more pass-heavy offense than they were last season. Looking at the rushing attack for the Detroit Lions, I got them rushing for about 2,150 yards and 20 touchdowns. So that's going to be a little bit of a decrease from last year. Again, it's going to be extremely hard for them to repeat almost 30 rushing touchdowns, but 20 rushing touchdowns is still very high. And so I have Jamyr Gibbs going for about 1,050 rush yards and 10 rushing touchdowns, along with about 500 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. So 1,500 yards, 13 touchdowns, and then 50 catches. I mean, this guy's a stud. He can do it all. And I think with those numbers, that's a better mean projection with David Montgomery coming back. I think if Monty was off the team and you are predicting if Gibbs is able to stay healthy, you're predicting him, I think, over around 1,700, 1,800 yards, maybe even 2,000 total yards, just with how dominant he showed he was when he gets a full workload. But Jamyr Gibbs is a stud. I have him currently right now as my running back 4. He's going as a running back 3. Just insane talent, insanely efficient. But I will say, running backs that finish as the fantasy running back 1 the year before rarely ever do great the next year. And I know that's just a conspiracy. That's just historical data that doesn't actually affect anything. But again, there's a lot of variance from year to year. And so I think with Jamyr Gibbs, I think that me personally, I don't think the Lions are going to be as good as they were last year, which means that I think that could mean some of these other pieces start to trail off a little bit and the offense maybe starts to slow down from what it was last year. I already mentioned the losses on the O-line. I already mentioned the losses of the coordinators. So I think that with Gibbs, while I do like him a lot and he is definitely in that elite tier of running backs, I think I'm a lot more excited to draft guys like Bijan and Saquon and even waiting a little bit to get somebody like Genty or Devon Achane over Gibbs, even if I think that's where he should be going. But I mean, we saw last year when Monty was hurt, he was averaging 32 fantasy points per game. So the ceiling is there with Gibbs, and he has the highest ceiling out of any running back. Looking at David Montgomery, I got him as my running back 23. He's being drafted as the running back 24. I have him going for about 900 rush yards and 7 touchdowns. So another really solid rushing season. And then I have him also going for about 23 receptions for 200 yards and a touchdown, where I think a lot of people are underrating that aspect of Montgomery. I mentioned last year, 36 receptions in only 14 games. That would rank top 10 to 15 in the NFL, actually, especially when it comes to the fantasy relevant backs in the NFL. And so I think with Monty getting that receiving upside because Goff is willing to check down, I think Monty year after year and once again is going to be a very high floor pick. And he obviously brings you that ceiling where if Gibbs goes down and he gets a full workload, you have a talented running back who's not only going to get a lot of touchdowns, but he's going to catch the ball and he's going to be getting 20 to 25 touches a game. So I think the upside is there for Montgomery. So I love him in best ball formats because he gives that high floor, but he also gives that high ceiling. So I think in drafts this year, he is definitely a steal. Let's get on now to the strength of schedule for the Lions and some of the playoff games. For quarterbacks, they have the 8th hardest schedule, and that pairs well with the receivers here, where they have the 7th hardest for receivers. So I think with this passing attack, that's maybe where some of the projections go a little bit lower and why, they might be facing some tougher defenses. Now, we all know with the strength of schedule, a lot can change from one year to another. You can have secondaries who will be top 5 one year and then bottom 5 the next. Example A, the Philadelphia Eagles, bottom 5 secondary in 2023, arguably top 5 secondary in 2024. So one offseason, one draft can change a lot. And so I think with this Lions team, yes, it is looking tough for their pass catchers and for Jared Goff, but these guys are elite. Like Amon-Ra is one of the top receiver duos in the league. You have a great tight end, you have two great running backs, and you have a gunslinger quarterback. So I'm not entirely worried about that. When you look at the other schedules, you have the 22nd easiest schedule for running backs. So that's going to be the 11th hardest. So it's not great for the running backs. But again, you're never going to sit Jamyr Gibbs. You're never going to not draft him because of, who they're playing. He's just a matchup proof player. So I think with the running backs, that's a little bit more concerning for David Montgomery, knowing that they might be playing some tougher rush defenses. And then on top of that, you're looking at a worse O-line than the year before. So I think Monty is the one who, again, could take a bigger hit if these things actually do come to fruition and they do play a ton of tough run defenses this year. And that's how it all works out. Tight end, they're right in the middle of the pack at the 17th easiest in the league. And I've talked about it time and time again on every episode, but I don't really look too much into it with tight ends because there's so many players on the defense that could end up guarding the tight end. And I think with Sam LaPorta, again, he is a matchup proof player if he does bring you back that upside that you drafted him for. The tight end room is just not that deep in the NFL. There's not that many great guys. If you're looking at tight ends 10 through 20 in fantasy, LaPorta is single-handedly better than all of them, and it's not that close. So with LaPorta, I'm not too worried about that schedule. But if we look at the playoff schedule in weeks 15, 16, and 17, which matters for your fantasy playoffs, it matters even more for those best ball playoffs where you're optimizing your lineup for those weeks in specific. But you play in LA against the Rams week 15, which is a golden matchup. The Rams do not have a good secondary. It's going to be a high scoring game like it always is. You have Goff versus Stafford. We all know how that trade went down. And so that's a great matchup. Week 16, you're at home against the Steelers, which means it's going to be a tough game, maybe because the Steelers have a good defense, but you are playing in a dome, which means that the snowy weather that you might see in Buffalo or you might see in Philadelphia or Chicago is not going to be a thing in Detroit. And I think that's the biggest advantage with these Detroit players is that they're playing half their games in a dome. And so weather is never going to be affected. Players are always going to play better in those circumstances. And so I think with these two matchups, these are both golden matchups for the fantasy playoffs. Whereas, in the past episode, when we were talking about the Packers, they have three brutal matchups. And it might not seem too big because, anything can change. But just looking at it, assuming that these teams are probably going to be similar to how we're projecting them, this schedule for the Lions looks good. And then you have the Vikings in week 17. It's going to be an away game. And not only, I wouldn't say it's a good matchup, but it's, again, you're playing in a dome. On top of that, you're going to have a divisional game where both teams are most likely going to be competing for the playoffs. So I think this is a slam dunk playoff schedule for the Detroit Lions. And I think it just makes me a lot more confident in drafting the pass catchers in this offense. Before we cap this episode off, let's just look at a couple storylines. We've discussed them throughout the episode, but we talked about, what's going to be the difference between a Ben Johnson-led offense and now a Dan Campbell / whoever their new offensive coordinator is, led offense. Because Ben Johnson is a great play caller. He's a genius on the offensive side of the ball. So I think they could take more of a hit than people think. And if they don't, that just means that Dan Campbell's a great coach and maybe Ben Johnson isn't as good of a coach. But I will say, I think this could affect the team as a whole, and the Lions could look a lot different comparatively to how some other teams might come out, obviously compared to the previous year in 2024. The other question I would say is, do they shift more towards a more Jamyr Gibbs full workload and kind of cutting David Montgomery, not fully out, but instead of, a 55-45, maybe a 75-25 in favor of Gibbs. And I think when we saw Gibbs, we saw how great he is as just a starter. And I just think the Lions are going to want to keep him fresh. They're going to want to keep him around for many years. So with Monty being a good running back, I see no reason why his role might change, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Gibbs now coming into his third season. Monty, one more year older in his career. I wouldn't be surprised if Gibbs continues to get an uptick in snap share, at least when both of them are on the field together. But that's going to end off this episode of the Detroit Lions in the 32 team series. I really hope that you all enjoyed this episode. Again, make sure to follow us on all of our social media accounts, on Instagram, on X, on TikTok, at Leatherbrains. You can hit the subscribe button on YouTube as well. The URL for that is going to be at Leatherbrains Podcast, and you can find all of the audio versions of our podcast on Spotify as well. Let us know in the comments what other things you want us to see, whether it's more week-to-week stats from last year, whether it's looking at more individual matchups from the season, potential trade pieces that these teams could do, mid-season, whatever it might be. Let us know in the comments. But I truly do hope everybody enjoyed. In our next episode, we're going to be covering the Minnesota Vikings to cap off the NFC North. So I'm very excited for that one, and we'll see you next time.